Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously fascinating journey. We aren't just looking at what happened in the past, we're actually going to look at the evolution of Ethiopian historiography. Basically, this is the story of how history itself was written down, who had the power to shape it, and how, honestly, the narrative was sometimes heavily skewed over the centuries. It's this incredible look into the mechanics of memory, how records are kept, and how the stories we're told, well, they aren't always the whole truth.
I actually want to start by throwing a deeply important question your way. Is it possible for history to be completely unbiased? Really think about that for a second. When we read a historical account, are we getting the cold, hard, objective truth, or are we just reading the perspective of whoever happened to be holding the pen at the time? Okay, let's dive right into this.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll hit 5 key areas. First, early indigenous historical writing. Second, the European study of Ethiopia. Third, the North versus South imbalance. Fourth, bias in the historical record. And finally, number 5, the modern era of study.
Number 1. Early indigenous historical writing, the royal lens.
To kick things off with Ethiopia's internal historical records, we really need to define what we're actually talking about today. We're looking at historiography, which is literally just the study of historical writing. It's analyzing how history gets recorded. And Ethiopia, it's incredibly special in this regard. It is one of the very few countries in the world boasting an indigenous tradition of historical writing that dates all the way back to the 14th century. And amazingly, this internal writing tradition kept going almost completely uninterrupted right up until the early 20th century.
So you're probably wondering, who exactly was doing all this writing for hundreds of years? Well, it was primarily chroniclers and hagiographers. But there's a catch, a big one. These chroniclers wrote almost exclusively about the achievements of the Ethiopian emperors. I mean, they were basically the ancient equivalent of a royal PR team. Hagiographers, the folks who wrote about the lives of religious figures, they also made massive contributions. But because their whole goal was praising rulers or saints, historians today have to be super careful. These texts are absolutely vital, don't get me wrong, but they are definitely not objective.
Let's just mentally map this out across our timeline today. We start way back in the 14th century with the beginning of those continuous indigenous writing traditions. Then we make a massive jump forward to 1684, which marks the first modern history of the region published over in Europe. And then we hit 1963, a total landmark year when the Institute of Ethiopian Studies was founded. Keep those 3 anchor points in your head. Number 2, the European study of Ethiopia, the external lens.
Shifting gears to the 17th century, European scholars started looking at the region from the outside. This whole external study of Ethiopia was pioneered by a prominent German historian named Job Ludolf. He's widely recognized today as the absolute founder of Ethiopian studies in Europe, and he basically created an entirely new academic pathway for outsiders to analyze the region's incredibly complex past.
And that brings us perfectly to our second major milestone, 1684. This is the exact year Job Ludolf published the very first modern history of Ethiopia in Europe. By laying down that foundational academic groundwork, he really opened the floodgates, paving the way for a whole wave of other Europeans to jump into Ethiopian studies and historical writing by the mid to late 19th century.
Number 3, the North versus South imbalance, the geographical lens.
Now, whether the history was being written internally by those royal chroniclers or externally by European scholars, there was a glaring, massive geographical flaw in the narrative. For centuries, Ethiopian studies focused almost completely on the northern part of the country. Up there, they had abundant sources and intense scholarly focus. But the south? It was almost totally neglected, like a ghost town for historians. Even the available physical remains down south went unstudied. Very few Europeans even tried to travel into the southern regions after the mid-19th century, and the tiny bits of information left behind were barely enough to piece together the history of the peoples and states living there.
So, why the huge imbalance? Why was everyone so drawn to the north? Well, the crucial point here is that the northern part of the country had 4 very specific historical advantages over the south. 1, the north actually had a written language to keep records, whereas the south had no written language at the time, meaning no written past. 2, ancient Greek, Roman, and Arab writers had already left behind some really important info about the northern region. 3, researchers could rely on a bunch of sources about the Christian kingdom that were sitting right there in the Egyptian Coptic church archives. And 4, the North just provided incredibly rich archaeological sources for study.
Number 4, bias in the historical record, the lens of objectivity.
But the problem was so much deeper than just geography.
The actual historical sources themselves lacked objectivity. Let's break down exactly how these biases formed. First off, a lot of the scholars doing these studies were directly attached to one royal family member or another, so naturally, they skewed things in favor of whoever was paying the bills. Second, scholars just didn't have access to relevant sources outside their own little bubbles. Third, many of them completely lacked sufficient knowledge of the broader political, social, and cultural realities of the whole country. And fourth, because of all this, studies focused entirely on the political history. Sure, there was some economic history thrown in, but there was absolutely zero social or cultural history. It was just a highly fragmented, super politicized version of the past.
And honestly, it's pretty widely recognized today just how problematic this was. Modern education systems are tackling this head-on. A grade 11 textbook, for instance, specifically prompts students in Activity 1.2 to critically examine this. It doesn't just ask them to memorize dates, it directly asks, is it possible to be completely unbiased in historical writing? It's awesome, actually. Students are actively being taught to question their sources and spot the profound limitations of early historiography.
Number 5. The modern era of study, the analytical lens.
Okay, so how did historians finally start fixing these huge flaws and bridging that massive gap between the North and South? Well, the ultimate turning point hit in 1963. That was the year the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, or the IES, was established at what was then Haile Selassie University. Founding this institute was the catalyst. It finally changed the long-standing geographic and thematic patterns that had essentially monopolized Ethiopian studies for centuries.
To fix that massive blind spot, the lack of written records in the South, the IES had to champion a completely different approach. First, they established a rigorous methodology for the scientific utilization of oral evidence. Before the 1960s, scholars were super reluctant to use oral history. Second, they actively went out into the field and collected these oral traditions, treating them as the highly reliable, vital historical sources that they are. And third, by using this fresh data, they were finally able to reconstruct the rich history of the southern peoples and states. It brought this incredibly much-needed balance to the nation's historical record.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. How does this lack of objectivity affect our understanding of the past today? When we look back at history, we have to remember the royal chroniclers who only ever praised their emperors. We have to remember the geographic imbalances that silenced entire regions. And we have to appreciate the vital, ongoing work it takes to uncover the full story. History isn't just some boring list of facts. It's a living, evolving discipline, completely shaped by whoever gets to tell the story. Thank you so much for diving into the evolution of historiography with me today. Keep asking those tough questions and always keep exploring the past.